In 1982, Sony revolutionized music with a compact disc.
Given the relationship Nintendo and Sony have nowadays, it might be a surprise to some younger gamers out there to learn that, once upon a time, the two companies seemed to get along quite well. After all, the two occupied quite different spaces. Sony was a tech giant, whereas Nintendo was a toy company that specialized in video games. Sure, the tech and toy markets share a bit of overlap, but within that overlap, Sony and Nintendo actually cooperated more than they clashed. Sony created the revolutionary Walkman in 1979, forever changing both the tech and music landscapes. Nintendo created the revolutionary Game Boy in 1989, forever changing both the toy and gaming landscapes. The Game Boy's concept and design took from the Walkman in many ways, least of all its very similar name, but Sony never seemed to hold any particular grudge over this. Sony probably were a bit annoyed with the Game Boy, but I don't think it was because they believed the Game Boy ripped them off or anything like that. No, I think, if anything, they were just genuinely upset that they didn't think of it first. Nevertheless, it was probably the release of the Game Boy that lit the fire under Sony's pants for them to begin dabbling in the world of video games, and they were ready to make it clear that they held no hard feelings towards Nintendo. Sony, quite famously, was the company that designed and manufactured the Super Nintendo sound chip, which was heralded as likely the best proprietary sound hardware of any game console of its era. This formed a fair amount of goodwill between the two, and as the console gaming landscape began to shift towards CD hardware throughout the early 90s, Nintendo was already making plans to shift from cartridge to CD-ROM. And to aid them in that transition, they would again choose to partner with Sony, the very company that had served to pioneer the compact disc. Development of a CD-powered add-on for the Super Famicom began pretty much simultaneously with the console itself, as far back as 1989. The so-called Nintendo PlayStation being two words, had several prototypes built, designed to allow for the use of Nintendo-produced cartridges and Sony-produced CD-ROMs. All went smoothly for about 2 years, with both Nintendo and Sony seemingly excited for what looked to be a very mutually promising future. And to the public eye, the two companies seemed like the best of friends. Of course, under capitalism, no two corporations are ever truly friends. No, corporations are only friends under the condition that both are somehow benefiting. And, well, Nintendo had quite a few qualms with how things would be run under the planned Sony-Nintendo partnership. See, during the heyday of the NES in the 1980s, Nintendo held an almost draconian rule over their licensees. Every game made for a Nintendo console used proprietary cartridges produced by Nintendo themselves, meaning any outside dev teams that wanted to make games for a Nintendo system had to pay the manufacturing costs up front. This was a big contributor to how Nintendo was able to stay on top. If a game flopped, Nintendo had already made a good chunk of money regardless, even as the developers themselves were hung out to dry. The Nintendo-Sony agreement would change this, and not in Nintendo's favor. While Nintendo would continue to own exclusive rights to their own cartridge-based tech, any CD-based games for the console would have half of that upfront licensing revenue split with Sony. Sony was of course enthusiastic about this, seeing the arrangement as a two-way benefit. Nintendo would be able to dip their toes into the budding CD-ROM business, and Sony would get a cut of Nintendo's lucrative console business. Backs get scratched, everybody wins. Nintendo did not see it that way. At the Summer Consumer Electronics Show in 1991, Sony officially announced that they were developing a Super Nintendo CD-ROM add-on in partnership with Nintendo. The very next day, Nintendo announced that they were not partnering with Sony, and that they would instead be partnering with Philips, at the time probably Sony's biggest rival in the world of compact discs. Sony was completely blindsided. This wasn't like with the Game Boy. Sony wasn't simply beaten to the punch fair and square by a great product. They were publicly humiliated, slapped in the face by a blatant breach of contract. This, of course, reflected badly on Nintendo, but especially so in their home nation of Japan. Instead of partnering with an established, successful, and respected Japanese company like Sony, Nintendo had chosen to instead partner with a foreign company like Philips. For Japan, especially in that era, this was seen as quite the business faux pas, even ignoring the way they had stabbed Sony in the back. But easily the ones who suffered worst of all were the actual consumers. The CDI, the console that resulted from the Nintendo-Philips partnership, was an embarrassing flop, and the software produced for it consistently dreadful. In addition, games that had already begun development for the Nintendo PlayStation were either cancelled entirely or, like what happened to Secret of Mana, had to be chopped up and crammed onto standard SNES carts, often resulting in buggy messes. Nintendo's sudden and public betrayal of Sony would go down as one of the biggest blemishes on the Big N's reputation, one of their slimiest business decisions, and one of their most shameful embarrassments. And from the wreckage, Sony would begin to craft their vengeance.
Come, look into the world of Sega Saturn.
E3, 1995. With Nintendo's Ultra 64 still over a year away, all eyes were on Sega and Sony's new 3D gaming consoles. Sega had just seen massive success in the US with their Genesis. Meanwhile, Sony was very much the new kid on the block, respected as a tech company but yet to prove themselves in the world of video games. Sega of America president Tom Kalinske takes the stage to announce the sudden surprise launch of the Sega Saturn, months ahead of its previously announced release date. He proclaimed that the Saturn would be available for purchase at all major retail outlets that very same day. Its launch price, $399 US. Immediately after this, Sony begins their presentation, announcing a handful of games for their upcoming PlayStation. After the showcase, Sony representative Steve Race, written speech in hand, utters just 4 syllables.
$299.
Consider the mic dropped. The PlayStation may have been a few months behind the Saturn, but consumers made it apparent that they were willing to wait it out if it meant paying less money for what honestly seemed like a more impressive console. With 3D capabilities that already seemed far beyond what we'd seen from the 3DO and Atari Jaguar, never mind the Sega Saturn. The irony of this moment is that Steve Race himself was a disgruntled former Sega employee. He had left in large part because Sega of Japan would constantly deny him the opportunity to pull stunts like this exact stunt that pretty much cemented the PlayStation's early sales successes. Meanwhile, Sega's surprise Saturn launch was something retailers and even Sega themselves weren't at all prepared for, and not in a good way. Kalinske was soon hit with word from the production lines that supply of finished Saturn consoles was still limited. What's worse, retailers were caught completely off guard by the surprise drop, with many complaining that they hadn't been given notice to prepare shelf space for the new product. And in response, a few retailers, even some major outlets like Toys R Us, would flat out refuse to sell the Saturn in protest. What Sega thought would be a triumph ended up completely shooting themselves in the foot. For the moment, Sony seemed like they were already on top. And not to mention, the PlayStation was already out in Japan, having beaten Nintendo's next console to market by a whopping 18 months. They would have their revenge on Nintendo yet. They already had a great head start. The PlayStation's US launch was almost a year after its initial release in Japan, but during that time it had already proven itself as quite the fancy little machine. Sony had a long history of innovative and revolutionary tech, and the PlayStation wasn't looking to break that streak. In terms of simple appearance, it was an attractive piece, sleek and lightweight in a simple rectangle shape, but accentuated by a circular disk drive and buttons that seemed to represent the console's CD-based nature. Compare that to Sega's Saturn, which, at least in its American incarnation, was a bulky, unwieldy black box, almost double the PlayStation's overall size in height and width, with its 2 controller ports just sort of awkwardly jutting out unceremoniously from the center of its blank black nothing. The PlayStation controller, while iconic and recognizable nowadays, was, in retrospect, probably the least creative thing about it. When you really break it down, it's essentially just a legally distinct Super Nintendo controller. Seriously, take away the grips and the 2 extra shoulder buttons, and it's functionally the same controller. I suppose it makes sense given the PlayStation's history. Hell, Sony originally considered having the console also play Super Nintendo carts, legalities be damned. And, I mean, I do really like the Super Nintendo controller layout, so it's not like I'm complaining exactly. But Sony also chose this, incomprehensible collection of shapes to label the face buttons in lieu of the typical letters or numbers, which is something we've all gotten accustomed to since then, but back then these shapes seemed like they only made sense to Sony themselves, and definitely took some getting used to. Of course, being a CD-based console, the PlayStation could also double as a CD player, with the caveat of needing to be hooked up to a TV. Granted, the Saturn could do this too, but Sony had much better experience in CDs than Sega did. After all, CDs were kind of Sony's whole thing back then. The PlayStation was pretty widely regarded as one of the highest quality CD players on the market, and this did quite a bit to further bolster its sales. But the downside to being a CD-based console meant saving your game became quite a bit more complicated. CDs are hard-coded with data, meaning they can't alter or retain additional data in real time the way a battery-backed cartridge would. On CD, the data is burnt in and can't be unburnt. Rewritable discs were still a few years off and would also be quite expensive anyway. In the past, consoles like the Sega CD would solve this issue by using the system's built-in RAM to record the player's saves. But these typically ran on a finicky and fleeting external battery that would need to be swapped out with a new one every few months or so, which would also unfortunately wipe all of your data. The Saturn would stick to this battery-powered RAM approach, although Sega would now offer dedicated memory cartridges for backing up your save data as well. These cartridges ran on flash memory and could thus retain data for years, even decades. Unfortunately, the Saturn's cartridge slot would prove to be notoriously fragile, randomly and suddenly wearing out, sometimes within a year or less, thus completely failing to read even the most pristine of carts. The PlayStation, however, had no dedicated method for saving data and would instead include 2 memory card slots placed just above the controller ports. These memory cards were essentially miniature flash cartridges dedicated to saving game files. At the time, it was a bit of a radical idea. In fact, a lot of game devs were concerned that memory cards wouldn't catch on, with many early PlayStation titles utilizing more traditional save methods, such as passwords, just in case. And indeed, it did take some time for a lot of people to wrap their heads around the concept of needing to buy a separate peripheral if they wanted to keep their progress after they turned the console off. I personally can tell you stories of several people I knew who bought a PlayStation and a handful of games, only to realize once they got home that they needed a memory card, thus leaving their console on for like a week straight while they waited for their parents to take them to the store again. But once memory cards did become a part of the public consciousness, people began to appreciate the benefits of them over cartridges. At first, it may have seemed strange that your progress wasn't saved onto the game or console itself, but a single memory card holds files from multiple different games, and files could even be copied from one card to another, meaning there was no need to bring your own specific game cartridge, or your entire console, God forbid, to a friend's house if you wanted to continue your own save. You were also no longer limited to just 2 or 3 files per game, since you could have multiple saves across multiple memory cards. And perhaps best of all, there was no risk of a friend or sibling callously overwriting one of your saves when borrowing a game for the weekend. Yeah, that's right, Danny. I remember, and I'm still annoyed. The PlayStation memory cards weren't perfect, though. Each card could hold 1 megabit of data, which was more than plenty for games of the era. However, games didn't simply take up their own individual file sizes while leaving the rest free. No, for whatever reason, every memory card was split evenly into 15 slots, and this would prove to be quite inefficient. A save file could never take up any less than 1 full slot, so even if a game only needed to record a few bits of data to, say, remember which number level you were on, those few bits of data would hog an entire slot to themselves. And if a save file, even by a single bit of code, spilled over into more space than a single slot could accommodate, it would take up an entire second slot as well. This became especially ridiculous in the console's later years, as games became longer and more complex, and could be further exacerbated by devs failing to efficiently optimize their games. A single Digimon World 3 save takes up 4 whole slots. Also take into account the simple possibility that someone may want to keep multiple files of the same game for whatever reason. This is a common practice for, say, RPGs and survival horror, 2 of the console's most popular genres as it turns out. Or games that require an additional system file for the sake of recording unlockables or bonus content. If your library of PlayStation games included more than, 3 RPGs, and assuming you're the type of gamer who likes to keep your completed saves for fidelity, odds are good you had a sizable stack of memory cards, each probably labeled to keep track of which had what. I personally have no less than 5, one of which is devoted to a single game. So, yeah, it wasn't perfect, but all things considered, I'd say it was still marginally better than what Sega was doing in this regard. Unlike the Saturn's internal RAM, PlayStation memory cards could last decades. I've yet to own a single one that stopped working. And the memory card ports were incredibly resilient and reliable. And that's really something I've noticed about the PlayStation in general. The thing is just surprisingly sturdy from top to bottom. And Sony one-upping Sega on price point at that E3 show would turn out to be an accurate foreshadowing of how PlayStation would change the landscape of gaming in the coming years. The switch to CDs meant that games would become far, far cheaper than they had ever been. The manufacturing cost for CDs was quite literally around 10% the cost of a cartridge, and this ended up being beneficial for both developers and consumers. Game devs no longer had to worry about going bankrupt on hefty upfront manufacturing costs, and consumers would also see the fruits of these lowered production costs. Games for PlayStation were typically priced at around $40 or $50, and discounted for as low as $20. Compare this to the standard SNES cartridges, which could go for $60, sometimes even $70, which, adjusted for inflation, would be almost $150 today. And you can bet your ass Nintendo wasn't exactly handing out discounts. With PlayStation, gaming was finally becoming affordable for the average consumer, as opposed to just dedicated hobbyists, and this played a massive role in its runaway success. And even just calling it a success feels like underselling it. The PlayStation wasn't just a local or regional hit, like consoles in prior generations had been. It was worldwide. It's not like how the Mega Drive was hugely popular in the UK, but a mild flop in Japan, or how the Master System had an oddly strong and lengthy following in Brazil specifically. The PlayStation was popular everywhere. In fact, as far as my research has told me, the PlayStation was the first console in history to be the highest-selling system in every country in which it was sold. And consistently so at that. Genesis and SNES were constantly neck and neck throughout the 16-bit generation, but the PlayStation was in first place from leg one, and stayed there. It's also worth noting that the 1990s were a fairly optimistic time in American history in particular. The Cold War had finally ended, and we were years away from beginning the War on Terror. The 90s were a time of relative peace in American culture, with an economy that was on a steady and promising upswing. Without the stress of any major international conflicts or massive financial crises, the average American could afford to put stock in silly, extraneous hobbies like video games or the tech sphere. And this was the perfect landscape for a product like the PlayStation to thrive. While the PlayStation was Sony's first console, it wasn't their first dive into the video game market. Sony had a video game publishing branch that would license and release games throughout the late 80s and early 90s. That being said, Sony didn't exactly have the best reputation within the market back then. They tended to publish a lot of licensed work, such as the NES Hudson Hawk video game, or Barkley Shut Up and Jam, neither of which were particularly well received. Occasionally they'd luck out and latch onto games with a bit more heft, like Equinox or Mega Turrican, but for the most part, Sony ImageSoft was akin to the likes of Acclaim or THQ. It was a logo that almost never boded well. But when the PlayStation launched in Japan around Christmas 1994, Sony would quickly turn this reputation around. The first year of the console's life saw a frankly staggering amount of notable releases, so much so that I would feel remiss not to at least pay lip service to them. Within the console's first month, we would see the release of both the first Ridge Racer and the first Kingsfield, the former of which being an iconic racing franchise turned tired internet meme.
It's Ridge Racer! Ridge Racer! Remember that one?
The latter being the first game ever made by a little dev studio named From Software, which would lay the basic groundwork for the entire Soulsborne genre. Kingsfield 2 would even hit the PlayStation with incredible turnaround time the following July. January 1995 would follow suit with Battle Arena Toshinden, a weapons-based fighting game that would pave the way for other popular franchises like Soul Edge/Soul Calibur. It was critically acclaimed as one of the most graphically impressive games on the console, even being compared to perhaps the most advanced 3D fighter of the generation, Sega's Virtua Fighter. Just 2 months later, PlayStation would also receive a port of the first Tekken, effectively establishing the machine as a welcoming home to the fighting genre. April 1995 would see the release of Jumping Flash, one of the earliest attempts at bringing the classic platforming genre into a fully 3D space. Adding a Z-axis to the classic run-and-jump formula was a surprisingly daunting task, as the new perspective would bring with it several frustrating complications. Jumping Flash would attempt to combat these issues by being played entirely in first person. After all, there was no issue of not being able to see where you were in relation to the next platform if you were literally seeing things from the character's eyes. Jumping Flash granted the player an inherent triple jump, over a year before Super Mario 64 I might add, and whenever you executed that third super high jump, the camera would tilt down so you could see your shadow below you and line up your jump to land on safe ground. This was a pretty revolutionary idea that certain future first-person games would implement as well, such as the Metroid Prime trilogy. That being said, the game was still quite clumsy and clunky to control, and most 3D platformers following this would forego the first-person perspective, but Jumping Flash was nevertheless an interesting and important first experiment. That same month would also see the release of Rapid Reload, or as it was known in Japan, Gunner's Heaven, a run-and-gun with an interesting gameplay twist. Your point counter actually depletes over time, requiring you to constantly retrieve more points dropped by defeated enemies, and passing certain point thresholds will see your weapons grow more powerful. Rapid Reload often found itself compared to a similar Genesis game called Gunstar Heroes, even considered a spiritual sequel by some. The first Ace Combat, then called Air Combat, came out the following June, the first entry in the long-running Namco Flight Simulator series. It was joined the very same day by Ark the Lad, one of the first JRPGs released for the platform, and one of the first games, period, to feature a fully orchestral soundtrack, made possible by the CD audio capabilities of the PlayStation. However, Americans wouldn't get the chance to play it until it was included in the Ark the Lad collection in 2002, ironically turning one of the first PS1 JRPGs released in Japan into one of the last PS1 JRPGs released in the US. September would give us the first Rayman game, which would become so wildly successful on PlayStation that most of us completely forgot that it actually came out on the Jaguar first by about a week. That's both a testament to the PlayStation's popularity and an insult at the Jaguar's complete lack thereof. Through September and October, developer Psygnosis would hit us with the double whammy. WipEout would join fellow racing franchise progenitor Ridge Racer, while Discworld was an adaptation of a series of fantasy novels by the late Terry Pratchett, brought to life in the form of a point-and-click adventure game, and presented in a stylized cartoon world full of sarcasm and wit. That same month, Konami would also port Tokimeki Memorial from the TurboGrafx 16 to the PlayStation. The game may occupy a niche of a niche of a niche among Westerners, but that is absolutely not so in Japan. Tokimeki was the game that codified the modern dating sim genre, in large part by, and I'm not joking here, being the first one to decide to not include any sexual content. November 1995 would bring us Beyond the Beyond, the precursor to future cult favorite RPG series Golden Sun, as well as the first entry in the wildly popular Twisted Metal franchise. December would follow suit with sequels to both Ridge Racer and Battle Arena Toshinden just 11 months from the release of their first entries. And of course, who could forget Gex? I mean, most of us, probably, let's be real. So many notable releases came out within the first year of the PlayStation's lifespan that it honestly left my head spinning a bit going over the entire list in my research for this video. Despite the Saturn coming out at more or less the same time as PlayStation, the most notable release for Sega's console during that same year, outside of ports of their popular arcade franchises like Daytona USA, Virtua Fighter, and Virtua Cop, was Panzer Dragoon. Not to decry Panzer Dragoon, of course, but compared to the absolute cavalcade of big releases we were seeing from the PlayStation, it just couldn't compete. Most third-party games released on Saturn were games that had already been on PlayStation for months. And keep in mind, by December 1995, the Nintendo 64 wasn't even out yet. It was still 6 whole months away. And it wasn't just the quality and quantity of releases that staggered me when I was going through this list, it was also the sheer variety of genres on display. Racing games, fighting games, run-and-guns, sports games, RPGs, platformers, point-and-clicks, dating sims. No matter which genres you were a fan of, PlayStation seemed to have a wealth of options for you right out the gate. And what's more, several of these games would launch entire new franchises, while others still would innovate future games for years, even decades to come. With the PlayStation, Sony came out fast and they came out swinging, and the competition could only struggle helplessly to catch up. Between its affordable price, sleek design, innovative technical advancements, and an absolutely stacked library of software, the PlayStation would almost instantly carve its spot within the cultural zeitgeist. It wasn't just the advent of 32-bit graphics that would kickstart the modern era of gaming. It was, quite specifically, the PlayStation.